growing trend of family estrangement. Not just family estrangement or discomfort like we put up with the weird uncle once a year at Thanksgiving, but more like parents and adults who haven't spoken in decades, or siblings who have removed each other so much from their lives that they may not even know when the other one dies. This kind of super intense, black and white, never look back estrangement that is more of a cleaving of any possibility of future connection. The article reported that in a recent survey of mothers between 65 and 75 with at least two children, that 11% were estranged from one child, and 38 of those had had no contact with their child in at least a year. The uptick of this kind of deep estrangement coincides, I can't help but notice, with the rise of cancel culture, which is the cultural phenomenon of canceling someone who is thought to have spoken or acted in unacceptable ways. This is usually done rather publicly, sort of a public shunning, greatly aided by social media. So I have to say, I think that there is a place for being called out when we've hurt others in word or deed. There's always a place for that. But the thing with cancel culture or completely shutting off someone from your life is it's really a door slamming shut. It's not always a healthy boundary. Often it's a wall instead of a boundary with barbed wire. It leaves no room for growth, for change, for grace, for maturation, or redemption for ourselves or anyone else. It leaves no place for cleaning up years of potential just misunderstandings, piled and piled and piled on one another. Shutting doors, slamming doors, and never looking back, acting as if someone doesn't exist or is nothing to you is extreme. Sometimes I fear it is hailed as being liberative or freeing. But really, in truth, no one has more power over us than someone we refuse to forgive. Now, it can be tempting to think that it might be easier, a little more simple to live in the black and the white, the good and the bad categories, rather than be in the gray. And increasingly in our siloed worlds, we have lost the ability, if we ever had it, to deal with interpersonal conflict in healthy ways. We can just remove that Zoom square on our screen. We can just unfriend someone or ghost them and never directly deal with it. Why do we need to? We can order anything that we need from Amazon or Instacart, not have to rely on anyone else at all to help us. We can keep our neat and tidy worldview and not get soiled with interpersonal messiness. We can do all of those things, that is true. And we can cut off our growth and connections, our potential for growth, our potential for connections as we watch our world get smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, let me say that I don't think anyone has the right to tell anyone that they must forgive someone else. I think that's sometimes a grave mistake of therapists and pastors. It's a tricky thing. And forgiveness can happen in a way that doesn't have to equal having a relationship with the person still. In fact, sometimes some of the hardest people to forgive are people who have died. And there are times when it's best to keep a healthy boundary with someone who is still alive, but to be in the process, in our hearts at least, even if we're not interacting with them much, to be in the process of our hearts to free ourselves from bitterness towards anyone. Friends, there are so many layers here, and it could be weeks of sermons, weeks of a series or a class. But I do have to say this. And yet, all of that is true, and yet, for Christians, here is also the truth. We cannot escape the truth that because we have been forgiven much, we are asked to show the same mercy and the same grace to everyone, no exceptions, and we cannot escape it. It all comes full circle at some point, and no matter how we get there, we have endless opportunities to free ourselves from our grievances, and that does almost always necessitate action, conversation, and treating others as the child of God that they most surely are. And I really worry that we've lost this ability, that we've lost any sense of being able to do this, especially in this era that we're in of deep, deep division and self-obsession. And I deeply believe that the only thing that will restore our humanity is to see beyond our well-curated worlds that promise false safety and to be in the messy business of actually having relationships. It is the only way to be braver with our lives, and God knows that this kind of bravery and courage are needed now. So let me fill in the parts of the story for you. You might have noticed that when we read the scripture, it seemed like we were hopping a bit all over the place because in some ways we were. We indeed hopped from chapter 43 of Genesis to chapter 50, and a lot happens in between there. So I will just briefly fill it in for you. Joseph, as you know, is sold into slavery in Egypt. And in that time, he becomes the right-hand man of Pharaoh and eventually the governor of Egypt. He had had the foresight to store grain for many years because he saw that a famine was coming, and he knew that would be the only way to feed the people. The famine indeed reaches Canaan, where Joseph's brothers and his father reside with their families and children and all of their livestock, and they run out of food. So they come to Egypt, hearing that there is food in Egypt, of course not knowing that Joseph is in this position. Joseph, though, recognizes them as they come, even though they do not recognize him. He decides there on the spot to help them, to give them grain. He takes their money from them, saying nothing, but then as they are leaving, he has a change of heart, even about taking money from them, and he asks one of his servants to slip the silver back into their grain sacks, not even telling them. And as they get home and open their sacks to find the money, they find that all of the money had been returned. They had to come back several times for help, and each time they came, Joseph created the conditions so that they would have to come back again, every single time. He still has not revealed to them who he is. And can you imagine, can't we just imagine the waterfall of emotions that he experienced when he sees them? I mean, there had to be, for any of us, there had to be this thought of, well, yeah, karma, what are you going to do? It has a way of finding you. You get what you deserve. You tried to kill me. You sold me off into slavery in order to do away with me. And now here you are. You might die if I don't help you. All of it, surely. He had these thoughts and these feelings. And also from the story, we know that he longed to be reunited, that there had been a well of grief there for years, the years they missed together. And underneath all of that, we know is love, even if it's so incredibly complicated. A few times in the story when Joseph is with them and they still do not know it is him, the text tells us that he has to leave their presence because his emotion is coming up so quickly that he has to step aside and go into another room just to compose himself at being so overwhelmed by the emotion of seeing them again. And of course, longing to see his father, not even knowing if his father was dead or alive. What was his internal dialogue? This is what I would actually love to know. His brothers, though, only knew him as the governor of Egypt, the one really close to Pharaoh, who had the power to help them or to hurt them. And to Joseph, that had to feel really good, that he was the one, in this case, with really all the power. And indeed, he had not only survived, but he thrived, and he was doing just fine, thank you. He had all the power now. How would he use it? Again, he steals himself away as he is with them one last time to regain his composure. And I think of him trying to hold it together in the room next door, and the shock and the outrage and the anger and the longing and the love all mixing together. What would win out? There's a saying a little bit later in the Old Testament from the book of Joel, where God says to the Israelites who have been to hell and back, what God says to them, beloved, I will restore the years that the locusts have eaten. In other words, I will help you heal what you thought was forever gone. So could these years that had been lost for Joseph and his family, could they be restored? Not like with a magic wand, as if it never happened, not just smoothing over things, but could there be deep and even real healing, even in the face of the awful and raw truth of what had happened? And it was awful. Joseph would never be free of the trauma. He would never be free of the sense of betrayal. He would always live with that. His brothers would always live, and they did live daily, with the fact that they told a lie, an awful lie, to their father, no doubt enduring their own troubled conscience for many years. And Jacob, the father of them all, lived with his grief. So much grief for so many losses, right alongside all the joys of growing in to be an old man. There was enough grief to go around, indeed, enough pain. And there are some things that have an expiration date. There are times when a day comes when it is too late. But as long as Joseph was alive, and as long as they were alive, he had a choice. He had a choice to open his heart, to wade into the messy middle of human relationships instead of further shutting the door forever. Friends, as long as we are alive, all of us, we have a choice. Daily, we have a choice. Will we give God a chance? Will we step out in faith and trust that there just might be a chance that any of us can change and grow? Will we dare to think that grace could be bigger than our pains, our betrayals, our guilts, our traumas? Can we reason in our rational brains that the God of the universe might just be able to deeply heal our hearts and the space inhabited between us? Can we set aside our pride at needing to be right, even if we are? Can we lay it down long enough to allow for a new connection, not one that sweeps it all under the rug, but one that incorporates all that has transpired into the current reality and agrees to start another chapter together? As long as we are alive, as long as we have our faculties about us, we have a choice. And Joseph had a choice. He took the chance. He chose nearness, not distance. He chose the messy middle instead of living in the black and white. He chose love over what would be very understandable hate. And God restored the years that the locust had eaten. It was not perfect. Indeed, it was not perfect. And there are many chapters after this, and many rights and wrongs done by their descendants who were also human, just like us. But friends, if the church is anything, if it matters at all in this time of dehumanization, in this time of divisions so deep that some feel justified to violence, if the church is anything in this time of increasing fear and isolation and loneliness, then let us be the place where messy relationships are celebrated. Let us be the place where we can learn from mistakes, be honest with each other in love, and forgive in deep and real ways. There are not many places left in society where we can come together in real time on a regular basis and rub shoulders, even pass peace with people who we might not agree with, who are different than us, who we have indeed had personal disagreements between us. But the church is the place where we can practice opening our hearts more and more, where we can truly experience grace and mercy and in turn give it away. And sometimes it might be hard to find deep love in our hearts, but at the very least we can find respect. And respect is the minimum of love. At the very least, God asks us to respect each other enough to learn to be in the good and the hard stuff together. It's called covenant, being in covenant with one another. Mercy and forgiveness indeed are the greatest of all the Christian virtues. It's what Jesus stressed over and over and over. It's what his whole life and death were about. And whether we like it or not, it all comes full circle in time with endless chances to lay down our pettiness and our pride and to forgive, forgive, forgive. Amen.